Today, we're going to talk about marriage, and joining us is Sean Gates, one of the most romantic men I know.
Or maybe the most newly married financial planner. One of those two.
Both can be true.
So, Sean, you're going to walk us through some lessons that people should heed when getting married when it comes to their finances, both from your personal experience and also your experience as a financial planner.
Yes.
So let's kick it off. What's the first piece of advice that you want to talk about?
Yeah.
Bestow.
Wisdom. So I think the first piece of advice that you can often read about that held true for me, because you always wonder how much of that stuff is true, but the first one that held true for me was very much like financial planning, you should have conversations about one another's goals, and especially short-term, medium, and long-term goals. And why this is important is, number one, you start to understand each other better, what you want to accomplish, make sure that you have some commonalities, and that the differences that you might have aren't too stark that it could cause some friction on down the road. But more importantly, common goals that people have are financial related. And you want to make sure that you can continue along the path towards your goals. So, for example, for me, I'm very much an adherent to the FIRE community, the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. And so ever since I was 24, I have been working diligently to try and retire and my working career and have money for the rest of my life at age 40. And marriage created an interesting dynamic in that my wife does not share that same goal directly. So she'll be comfortable working until normal retirement age, let's say. And so I think one of the lessons that I learned early on is that I was very clear with her that this is a goal for me and understood it. And then we got married. But what then revealed itself was I didn't relay how seriously I was about it. I mean, I am going to be successful at this goal one way or another.
If I have to live in a broom closet at the Motley Fool for my retirement.
And practically speaking, at least when you and I first knew each other, you were saving well over half your income to accomplish this goal.
Correct, and still am. And so that is, that kind of ties into this whole thing because she's a good saver, no question, but I'm on the abnormal end of...
In so many ways. Good ways. So many good ways.
Yeah, and so I think, it's a common thing in the FIRE community that you tell someone that you're going to do this and they're like, oh yeah, sure. Like, you aren't married, so things will change, or you haven't had kids and things will change. But I've been so dedicated to this cause that it's going to happen. And so I'm going to drag my wife along kicking and screaming. But So anyway, I think
we need to swap out our expert for this episode. Can we do that? Can I call an audible on this one? You're out, kid. I'm sorry.
out.
Yeah.
I'm out.
No. All right, fine. Keep talking. We're stuck with you. Well, I think you're very deliberate about how you approach money, right? Like this
Correct.
is a commitment. This is, exactly how you're going to achieve your goal of retirement by 40. But I think a lot of people don't even really have a good grasp on their temperament when it comes to money, or they don't really think that, they just think it's easy to assume these are my habits with money. I assume everyone's the same way. And I don't even have a good grasp on, I'm going to marry a man who doesn't like to buy a new sweater every week. Why? I don't know. I didn't even know that was a thing, right? It's
totally. Yeah. And I think that's why I think I'm advocating that having these conversations around goals can start to develop that understanding of your own temperament with money and then your partner's temperament with money and just kind of find common ground. And it's a good practice to have.
For the record, I do have a problem with wanting to buy a new sweater every week. and my husband has given me the space to do that, just like I give him the space to buy robot parts and other things like that.
Exactly. That's actually in here.
Robot parts. It's a line item. All right, what's your next piece of advice?
Yeah, so the next piece of advice that you read about that is very good advice is to be upfront, be clear about your financial details. So kind of going through line by line and saying, here's how much student loans I have, here's my budget that I have had as a single person and might have going forward, here's my credit card debt. All of that stuff is very good to do because it gives you full visibility into what you're getting into. And you need to know that. It also creates a sense of honesty early on, which is critical, I think. Everyone would agree. But I think further, you can actually start to understand your partner's values. And so this was a really stark shift for me, I think. And a little bit of this is because my partner is not an American citizen, but the definition of family in India is, in my opinion, a little bit different than in America. So I have a very small family. I have a good relationship with my siblings, but it's not a very, very close relationship. And in India, you have the same relationship with extended members of your family. So your cousins are often called your sisters or your brothers, and you treat everyone in a tight-knit community. And so I knew this going into the marriage, and it's actually one of the things I love about my wife. But I should have seen coming that it creates its own set of interesting knock-on effects, which is that there have been times already in our short marriage where, and there are pros and cons, but there have been times in our marriage where we might have to spend money that I didn't think we would have had to spend had I not thought this through. So having to host guests in the city because they just happen to be in town and can then see everyone. So then we have to put them up in a hotel, and that might be $500 for that month that you weren't planning on spending, that just kind of creep up. And there's a whole bunch of those. But I think the broader point is that as you go through the details of your financial situation, try and glean the values of your partner so that you can try and anticipate some of these unknown expenses that you get comfortable with.
Is there any sort of checklist or framework or anywhere people can go to do that running list of checking out your financial details? And because this feels like this is something where you need to sit down with a checklist and be like, okay, student aid, do you have it? Yes, no, okay, check. Next, like, it'd be easy to be like, oh yeah, no, I'm fine. and then you're like, oh yeah, aside from my $50,000 worth of credit card debt, like, right?
Totally. And I think so. In one of the things that we want to go through are resources that help people, and one that I listed that I think is critical, which gets to your point, is the automated budgeting tools. And the reason that I know we've talked, you guys have talked about those. I've talked about those a number of times, but things like Mint or Personal Capital, any kind of automated budgeting software, you need a budget. So those budgeting apps are extremely helpful because in those moments, you can actually just be like, okay, what's my net worth? And net worth is the financial snapshot that I think explains the possible, debts, incomes, out, all of that good stuff. And that's the place to go. And you don't have to remember, right? I mean, if I put you on the spot and said, tell me all of your stuff, you might have just forgotten about a thing, and I'm not going to hold you accountable for it. Whereas if you have these tools, it's all there for you. You just pull it up. So I think that's great.
And might I also recommend the Newlywed game, which you could find if you Google it. And we talked about this 2 years ago on the podcast.
Yeah, we did that a long time
But
ago.
it's basically 10 questions about money that each person does separately, and then you compare results, like how much money do we need to be happy? How much can you spend without having to ask the other spouse? Prioritize these various things, retirement, house, things like that, in order of what's important to you. And then you'll find out how much you're on the same page.
That's awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a great resource.
We have a few of them at the Fool.
We do.
All right, what's your next piece of advice?
Great. And then I think that the last one is, and this is becoming more and more common, but I would say lean into the prenuptial agreement conversation.
Ooh, that's a toughie.
Really?
That's a toughie.
Controversial take with Sean Gates. Really?
Yeah, and I should say, I'm not holding myself out to a higher standard. We failed at this. We did not have an explicit prenuptial agreement conversation, but we had a quasi conversation about what things would look like if the marriage didn't go as well as we had hoped. But I think the problem with that is, I think there's a couple problems with that. Number one, you typically don't want to have that conversation in the swoon phase of a relationship because it just puts a damper on things. But I think it sets you up to have a potential later conversation, and this is something that people don't talk about as nearly as much, which is if you don't do a prenuptial, you're not a bad person. You can actually enact a postnuptial agreement. And so it's very similar to a prenuptial agreement. It has a lot of the same kind of information that you would go over what you want your assets to be disposed of after you separate, all of that stuff. But if you've structured yourself to have prenuptial agreement conversations, you can have that postnuptial agreement conversation after having learned about each other in the day-to-day finance of your lives. So, you've gotten married, you've spent 6 months or 12 months with each other, you understand each other's spending habits better. And it sets you up to enact a good postnuptial agreement instead of kind of being unsure about what you would put in a prenuptial because you haven't gotten married yet. You don't know enough to put it together and not hurt one another's feelings potentially. So,
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, many of the things you find out about a person when it comes to money, you don't find out until you get married.
Yeah.
So awkward. Now that I really know you financially, I would like a postnuptial agreement, please, because I just have some feelings. Love you.
We just need Mario. It should just be called the marriage agreement.
The marriage agreement. Yeah.